Welcome back to Will I Ever Learn Chinese? I'm Jeanette Sekel, and in this episode I'm talking about how Chinese became a research interest of mine. From day one on of learning Chinese, I gained new insights into how languages work, and this was always relevant to my work as a linguist. And every day I was learning Chinese, I was constantly in awe of how learning a new language can give you new insights into the workings of language and what is behind learning languages. As my proficiency of Chinese increased, though, I became more and more intrigued by the structures of this language and the practicalities of language learning that I was now experiencing daily. And I was understanding the theories of second language acquisition, but doing the second language acquisition myself and reflecting on the second language acquisition myself gave this a whole new perspective. So sometimes the studies we can do can be very far removed from the practicalities of what happens on the ground. But in this case, I was coming from the ground and then starting to look at the actual theories behind. One of the first things that became apparent as I was learning to speak was this overcoming of the speaking hurdle. This was a real issue. This is something that learners have to deal with, and this is often something that is really tricky to sort out. First of all, as a learner, you want to come across as relatively coherent, as relatively fluent, speaking in a relatively okay way. And then your interlocutor, the person you're speaking to, wants to be put at ease as well. They don't want to be constantly waiting for you to get the right word out or to think about the right word to say. So for intermediate learners, this is a very big hurdle, this overcoming, finding the right words, etc. And also this is obviously a hurdle to gaining confidence in speaking. So how can you develop this communicative proficiency? What can you do? Is there a shortcut? As an intermediate learner of Chinese, I was consuming podcasts daily, and I came across some podcasts that were discussions where native Chinese speakers would interview learners of the language. Most of the time, those learners' Chinese was considerably better than mine, but it was obviously not perfect. It was interesting though. At first I thought that these interviews weren't really relevant, but I realized that the learners that were slightly better than me were using strategies that I could copy, and I've discussed this in a previous episode. I realized that in a lot of the interviews, the word 然好 and then was used, and the learners would use this not just to say that something happened after something else, but rather connect the different contexts very loosely, and sometimes use 然好 just to fill a pause. I started to listen out for this word in other contexts, and I realized that this would be a great strategy for me to adopt when speaking. In particular, using it as a sort of placeholder instead of constantly saying, or having a total pause, not saying anything at all. I realized that the learners, the people who were interviewed in these podcasts, were using a range of markers that I had previously not necessarily been aware of. And it seemed that these markers seemed to make their speech much more fluent, especially to my ears. For example, speakers would sometimes start their sentences with nama, and that would then set off what they were saying afterwards. Sometimes these speakers would give minimal responses when the other person was speaking, such as 是的 or 有道理, right, or that makes sense. Sometimes when the learners were speaking, they would invite the other person to speak by asking little questions such as 对吧, right? By listening to the learner interviews, I got used to these expressions. And because the learners were using an overall slightly simpler language, and these expressions stood out, I was learning them from the learners. They weren't part of this overall cacophony of sound that native speakers would make when they would say things I couldn't quite decipher yet. Rather, they were standalone elements. I could see the strategies that these other learners were using in order to speak more fluently. So I was able to copy these strategies. And I learned them. This was really interesting. I was learning discourse strategies from people who were not yet very good at discourse either. They were just slightly better than me. But they had helped me boil the language down to the bare bones, making the language easier to my ears, and I could then concentrate on those few structures that stood out and learn them, and thereby progressing. I had gained an insight here that if I had looked at language learning purely theoretically, I might not have found in the same way. I decided to look at this in more detail, and I started a research project. Now, starting a research project involves a few things, and it is not necessarily as straightforward as just going, I'm going to learn Chinese now, and then start learning Chinese in your own time. First of all, I had to apply for ethics approval at my university to ensure that the data I was using and the way I was conducting my research was appropriate. For the ethics application, I had to outline what type of data I was going to use. So I was listening to the various podcasts again and then decided to focus on a series of interviews done by the same host but with different speakers. And these speakers were all learners of the language that spoke Chinese pretty well. This kept the format more or less consistent, I reckoned. And also the speakers interviewed in this series were all rather proficient, so in a way they were what I would have called fluent at the time in general lay meanings. They were speaking coherently, they were speaking fluently. Once I had decided on the data to use and I had gained my ethics approval, I had to have the interviews transcribed. This means writing down what is being said. And transcription can be quite a cumbersome thing, and I've done that many times when I was working on various languages. But today, with the big languages such as Chinese, it's really, really easy. You put it into a program, for example, a podcast or video editing program, and then it does the transcription for you pretty much. It was quite easy. It turned out there were also transcriptions available for this particular podcast series, so I could use those as well. But overall, I wanted to make sure that what I was analyzing was actually right, and I needed a native speaker to go over this, to ensure that the different discourse strategies I was looking at were appropriate, and also that the transcriptions were right, because sometimes these things don't always go right when you do them automatically. I had a small sum of research funding, so I was able to find a Chinese student at my university who was keen to work with me as a research assistant. And he went through all of the recordings, and we discussed the different strategies that the learners were using when communicating with the native speaker. He also ensured that all the transcriptions were appropriate and were right. He was not a linguistics student, but he was interested in the language, in how Chinese could be taught, and he was very meticulous in his work. He also found the language of these learners fascinating, and he frequently commented on how some of the speakers had learned the language extremely well. It turned out that my research assistant had actually attended one of the approval sessions as a student when I had been chairing an institutional and program approval with a university in China. He had then joined my university for his final year of his undergraduate studies. He said that he remembered me speaking some Chinese in the meeting and told me that this had been a really positive thing and was much appreciated by his fellow students but also by the staff at the university. Wow, the world is a small place. So once the data were in place, once my transcriptions were there and everything, I started to analyze the use of the discourse markers by the speakers. And I was going through the data, tagging the different ways in which the speakers were signaling fluency. And I picked up a lot of the language along the way. Again, I was learning Chinese while doing something else, in this case my research. Initially, I had some ideas as to what I would likely find in the data, but when I looked at the data in more detail, I realized that some of my preconceptions had not been totally accurate. I was looking at the cold, hard facts of data, and my subjective, very personal view was actually challenged by the objective, data-driven view. This was interesting, as I could combine the two. I could use my own intuition as, this is really helpful to guide me in finding a topic to study. Then I would use robust research methods to study the situation in more detail and get objective, verifiable results. I would use these results in guiding my own research as well as guiding my own learning of Chinese, so ultimately feeding back to my learning and then also contributing to the literature on second language acquisition. But also, I wanted to share the results much wider with learners of Chinese and learners of other languages, as well as teachers that would not necessarily pick up an academic journal to read an academic article, but rather that were looking for strategies to help them improve their way of speaking in a foreign language. This sort of sharing of information, which we call knowledge exchange, is really important to me, and ultimately is also what this podcast is about. As I was pondering this study, a conference announcement was made. This was in my research center, organized by members of my research center, but it was a large international conference on language and inclusion. And as a professor in the field, I decided to take part. It would be a very nice way to share my findings on the discourse marker study, I thought, because there was also a relevant workshop on related topics. So I wrote an abstract. Abstracts are short summaries of research that you submit to conferences. And then I got the abstract accepted, which meant that I would be able to join the session. At the conference, I presented my findings. There were a range of Chinese speakers in the room as well, and it was quite fascinating to discuss my findings on 然后 and then. That could be used as a filler word as well. Some of the younger members of the audience would say that they would use this form themselves, but others said that they would only ever use 然后 to indicate temporal succession, so after that, rather than as a filler, as an empty element that you just put in. And one of them said that he'd rather be seen dead than using 然后 in this way. Wow! I had at that stage read a lot about discourse markers in Chinese, and I'd also come across a fair few studies that included the use of 然后, but I had not realized that some people have such strong feelings towards this expression. But I guess this is very similar to what we have in English, where constructions such as I was like can be used as a quotation marker. For example, younger people may say, and then I was like, yeah, let's go there, and he was like, give me a minute. And this would basically mean, and I said, let's go there. And he said, give me a minute. So it would quote what we had said in that particular situation. Some people would say that they would rather be seen dead than using this construction. Well, for many younger speakers, this is just part of language. This discussion about the use of 然后 got me thinking about something else, namely to which degree I, as a learner, was learning a certain variety of Chinese that was perhaps associated with younger people. And that could just be because of the materials I was using. I was listening to podcasts, many of which were made by younger people, not all of them, but many. I was watching television dramas that may have been aimed at a younger audience. So sometimes when I was using some of these new expressions I had learned in these contexts, my teacher, in this case the lady my own age, would sometimes say, well, you can't say that. And then I'd be confused and say, well, I've heard this being said a lot and I've now learned it. For example, I was talking about a singer and I said to her, 他不是我的菜. He's not my type, I'm not really interested in him or his music. This is literally translated, he is not my dish. 他不是我的菜. My teacher was puzzled as to what I was trying to say and queried this, and then said there wasn't such an expression. Well, we looked it up online, and then we realized that this was quite a common expression in the slang of younger people, usually used in online conversations, and obviously also used in some of the TV dramas I'd been watching, where I'd learned the expression. But Chinese speakers of my generation may not necessarily have come across this expression at all. Of course, this is quite typical of language. Younger generations will have other expressions. And I don't always understand the slang my daughter is using in English either. She kindly explains it to me, very patiently sometimes, but still, this is not always accessible to me. And this is natural, this is normal. It's the way language is changing, constantly, right under our noses. Was the Chinese I was learning that of a younger generation? Actually, I decided that this would not really matter that much at this stage. I would eventually pick up the different styles and formalities in context and then choose one appropriate to the situation I was in. And as long as I was progressing in the language, that would be fine. But I made a mental note that should I be in very formal situations again, such as running approval meetings and the like, I would try to stick to more formal wording, if possible. So, what did my research show? Can you really come across as more fluent by using discourse markers? Well, I found that the discussions I analyzed, some speakers used quite a lot of discourse markers, others used very few as 10 different types. Some speakers had pet discourse markers, so those that they were using again and again and again. And don't we all have that? We all have these words we really like. There were a good number of discourse markers that were common across all of the speakers. And some of these discourse markers that could help along a conversation considerably were markers that would help with the management of the overall interaction, such as minimal responses, how, 就是, and so on. Yeah, right. And also tag questions such as 是不是, isn't it, or similar. Then there were markers that could be used as fillers in situations where you needed a little bit more time to think. 我觉得, I think. 对我来说, in my opinion. 觉得, like that. 这么说, as you can say, and so on. So these markers would be used and could readily be inserted without having too much meaning or just saying, I think. And then it would buy you a little bit of time to continue your thought process and be able to speak more fluently. And finally, there were a number of markers that could structure the overall conversation and that could structure the overall argumentation. So, for example, saying 所以, so, 然后, and then, which we already discussed, could also be used as a filler, and other things like 其实, actually, 肯定, definitely. Some of these would also be used to strengthen one's argument, for example. I made a list of those that were particularly common in the language of these learners and that I found particularly useful. So, would I be able to learn them? Well, through analyzing the data, I learned all of the discourse markers that were used, and I learned more because I started to pay attention to them in context. And I started to use them. But can discourse markers really be taught? Imagine you're a teacher and you have a classroom full of students who want to speak more fluently. What can you do? Well, you can try and teach them these discourse markers. At least you can expose them to these discourse markers. But procedural knowledge of this type, knowledge that you can just use, needs to be learned through exposure. It needs to be learned in context. And it can't necessarily just be taught, because then it's much more difficult to retrieve it. By exposing yourself to the spoken language and by listening to these markers being used, and for example also by teachers using these markers in context, the students will eventually pick them up. I found what really helped me was listening to these expressions by other learners, so these expressions standing out more. And again, this is something that can be integrated into teaching methods. For me, learning some of these expressions were really great because they helped me signal fluency or a more coherent speaking style, because I was now able to fill those pauses, to not say or be silent in order to think, but rather I would have these little words that I could use, these little expressions that I could just throw in, and then I would be able to speak more fluently after that. And I was also getting much better at giving minimal responses to the people I was speaking with, making me a much more engaging person to speak to. It was quite interesting because the conference I was presenting at was mainly a conference in the area of applied linguistics, which is one type of linguistics where, well, linguistics is more applied. It's about second language learning, the analysis of discourse, and so on. And I'd been working at the intersection of applied linguistics and theoretical linguistics for a fair few years. However, my main research was really quite firmly rooted in theoretical linguistics. And many of my peers in theoretical linguistics would sort of sneer at introspection or would look at autoethnographies as not really something that is proper research. Yes, some theoretical linguists would use grammaticality judgments, so they would think, is this structure correct? And then, well, base their research on that. But quite often this would have to be replicated by a range of speakers and so on before it could be used. However, I realized that at this conference, doing an autoethnography, using introspection alongside a robust research study was actually absolutely fine. There was nothing to worry about. It was a common thing in applied linguistics, and you don't just need numbers and statistics or other verifiable data. You can also use subjective or introspective data. This I found really interesting because I was going out of my comfort zone again by attending a conference slightly outside my field, but thereby being confronted with a methodology that was very much what I was doing at the time, and I was feeling slightly vulnerable about. But it turned out that this methodology was absolutely fine in the area that I had entered now. This again made me reflect on the methods that I had used to date and the validity of these methods. And I realized that in my linguistic fieldwork, introspection and membership of a speech community had become very important. This is something I will be looking at in a coming episode on the similarities between second language acquisition and linguistic fieldwork. So, Chinese had become my research topic, and in a way that was almost inevitable, wasn't it? It was only a matter of time before I would get into the situation where I wanted to find out more about what I was doing. But combining introspection, combining my own experience with research studies and a more objective view of the data was a fantastic way, both for myself to learn the language, but also to bring my research into a totally new direction I hadn't really anticipated. If you had asked me about this 2 years ago, I would have said I wouldn't do this sort of research. And here I was, learning new things, going into other directions, discovering new methodologies, all because of Chinese.